Out here on the rim country, where the wind pulls dust across the flats and the silence presses against a man's chest like a weight, stories don't come from books or papers. They rise up from the ground itself, from the footprints left in frost, from the barns where strangers try to hide, from the cabins where lonely men sit, watch with a rifle across their knees. Tonight's story comes from such a place, a stretch of northern Arizona territory in the late autumn of 1882, when the sky ran gray and the earth held only the bitter smell of sage. But before we settle into it, friend, I'd ask you kindly, if this tale grips you, if you find meaning in what these hard lives carried, then take a moment right now. Like the video, leave us a comment telling where you're listening in from, and subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next story from the Frontier Legacy. Your voice and your presence keep these fires burning. The story begins with Calder Vane, a man forged by silence and shadow. Once he was a Union scout, riding long miles through storms and smoke, watching the edges of battle where the land bled red. He came home scarred, not with a limp of the leg, but a limp of the spirit. He'd buried his wife before he even had the chance to hold her through a fever, and after that, he chose a life stripped down to cattle, fences, and the unyielding quiet of the flats. His days were simple, boots crunching over dry earth, coffee cooling in a tin cup, eyes narrowed always at the horizon. But simplicity does not mend the hollow inside a man. He had grown used to the hollow, used to the kind of loneliness that makes even silence feel dangerous. And then came movement, not the broad sweep of cattle, nor the familiar sway of a horse, but something smaller, cautious, and desperate. Calder had seen enough of the world to know the difference between a thief's swagger and a starving soul's stumble. He found her near the barn, crouched by the feed barrel, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the season. She was young, too young for the kind of bruises painting her skin, too young for the weight that bent her shoulders. Asha was her name, though he didn't know it yet. She was Apache, cast out by her people, discarded by those who should have protected her. Hunger had driven her to risk death for a handful of oats. Shame had driven her eyes to the ground when she spoke. And yet, when she opened her mouth, the words startled even him. "Have mercy. I can make you a dad if you forgive me." Strange words, desperate words, but they told the truth of her heart. She was not begging for herself alone. She was bargaining with what she thought a man might want most: family, legacy, belonging. Calder did not laugh, nor did he strike her. Instead, something inside him shifted, faint as the creak of old wood in the night. He recognized desperation's voice because he had carried it himself. Once for his wife, once for the silence that followed. He lowered the rifle, not in surrender, but in recognition. From that moment, the story takes its slow breath. He gives her no promises, only a blanket on hay, a plate of food, a cot moved from the shed. But in the language of the frontier, where words are rare and gestures hold the weight of vows, that was enough. For Asha, every small mercy was a seed: food without cruelty, shelter without demand, work without mockery. For Calder, every act of restraint was a reminder that he could still choose who he was. He was not a man who took from the desperate. He was a man who had endured loss, and now had the chance to protect rather than destroy. This introduction is not about romance quickened by firelight, nor about sudden salvation delivered from heaven. It is about two exiles, one scarred by war, the other scarred by rejection, who collide in the dust and must decide whether mercy can bloom into something stronger than fear. The land around them is barren, stripped bare by autumn winds. Yet even barren soil remembers how to cradle seed when rain finally falls. Calder's cabin, lonely and stiff with years of silence, begins to breathe again. Asha, who had been called cursed, begins to find her worth in the swing of an axe, the sweep of a broom, the steady gaze of a man who does not flinch from her scars. In the chapters ahead, you'll hear of storms that tested their walls, of fires that warmed more than flesh, of the old griefs they dared to speak and the new hopes they risked to claim. You'll hear of the moment when hands brushing over firewood became a promise, when silence by the hearth became a shelter, when two hearts bruised by exile began to beat in rhythm. And you'll hear too of the riders who came looking, carrying whispers of curses and shame. But most of all, you'll hear of choice, the choice to stay, the choice to believe, the choice to build something new in a world that had given them every reason to surrender. So stay with me now, and remember, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if these stories mean something to you. The frontier was not built on rifles alone. It was built on choices like these, where one act of mercy could shape the course of two lives, and perhaps even generations yet to come. The night after Calder first lowered his rifle, the air inside his cabin carried a weight he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the smell of coffee or the faint creak of timber cooling under the frost, but the knowledge that a stranger lay in his barn, silent, bruised, and too young to be so worn. He sat on the porch with the Henry across his knees, eyes on the dark horizon, trying to understand what had moved in him when she whispered for mercy. It wasn't pity, not quite. It was something closer to memory. He had known what it was to have nothing left to bargain with except breath itself. And now he'd seen that same bare edge in her face. In those first hours, his mind turned like a millstone, slow and heavy, grinding down doubt and habit until only one thing remained. She would not be sent back into the wind. The land could be merciless enough. He would not add to it. And so, while she curled on hay in the barn, clutching a threadbare blanket like it was the last rope left to her, Calder sat stiff-backed, wrestling with the silence, feeling for the first time in a decade that he was no longer the only soul bound to it. When the morning came, the frost painted every fence rail in silver, and the pump handle groaned as though the cold had bitten deep into iron. Calder splashed his face in the biting water, eyes stinging awake, and carried the weight of the night back toward the barn. Inside, the animal shifted gently, and in the far stall, she sat upright, arms wrapped around her knees, as if bracing against more than weather. Her hair was tangled, feathers and cords hanging loose, her dress torn enough to show the bruises she had not tried to hide. When he asked if she was hungry, her silence pressed harder than any refusal. So, he walked out, cooked what little he had, and brought it back on a tin plate. Eggs, pork, and softened biscuit, setting it on straw without word or judgment. He did not watch her eat. He only asked her name as he left. Asha, she said, and for him the sound of it landed like a stone dropped into a still pool. He carried that name back to his porch, where the coffee had long gone cold, and he repeated it once in his head like a promise he hadn't agreed to yet. Through the long hours of that day, as he hammered fence slats and trimmed brush, the weight of what he had chosen settled into him. He had meant only to keep her from dying in his yard, but by evening when he returned, the barn told him more than words could. The floor had been swept, the oats stacked neat, the tools rehung in order. She was standing with a broom in her hand, not waiting to be thanked, not asking to stay, simply making herself useful, as if her worth could be carved out in silence and labor. When she looked at him, the cut beneath her eye still raw, her gaze was hard as stone. "You going to send me away now?" she asked, voice roughened by more than dust. He could not answer quick. His chest tightened at the truth of it. He did not know yet. All he could see was the dirt on her cheek and the steadiness in her jaw. Then she spoke of why she had come to this. Cast out by her people after pain no woman should bear, blamed for a life lost that was never hers to answer for. She did not tremble, did not beg. She said the words with a finality that cut through him sharper than any wind. Calder listened, and in her blunt telling he found no deceit. What he found instead was the unmistakable ring of a soul still unbroken. He reached into the old crate by the wall and threw her a folded wool blanket. "Cold tonight," he said. It was not comfort, not quite. It was recognition, the only kind he knew how to give. That second, night. As the wind clawed at the roof and the land shuddered under its howl, Calder pictured her wrapped in wool, waiting for the next blow she had always known to follow. He imagined her heart pacing, listening for footsteps that never came. He did not speak to her, nor she to him, yet the silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. By the third morning, when he stepped outside, he found her already bent over the goat pen, sleeves rolled back, fingers raw from pulling wire into place. She looked up with the sun in her eyes and said he moved too slow. Her first jest, sharp as a spark struck in cold flint. He grunted half a laugh, surprised at how light it sounded in his own throat. Kneeling beside her, he saw how her hands worked steady, unafraid of labor. She carried herself not as a cast-off, but as one who had known work long before she reached his fence line. When he asked her band, she admitted Sierra Ana, with the pause of someone who had learned that names could be twisted into weapons. He nodded, filing the truth away like a landmark on a trail. They finished the fence together, their hands passing tools without need of speech, their shoulders almost brushing. For the first time, Calder felt something shift inside the silence. Not suspicion, not burden, but the beginnings of an understanding. And in that quiet, he realized she was not just staying the night. She was already beginning to stay. The days that followed carried the sound of winter building across the rim. Wind through sage, clouds sagging low, and the smell of damp earth when the first storm pressed close. Calder had never much liked storms. They rattled his cabin like old bones and kept his mind restless, with memories of nights spent in war camps, rain turning rifles slick and nerves tighter than wire. Yet now, as the sky bruised and the first cold sheets of rain slid across the flats, he wasn't alone to shoulder it. He found himself watching Asha more than the weather, noting how she moved with a steadiness born of survival, her bruises fading, her shoulders straighter each day. She worked as if waiting for him to tell her she wasn't welcome. But the truth was already settling inside him like roots beneath frost. He had no thought of sending her away. He wasn't sure when that decision had taken hold, but it was there, unshaken, stronger than the storm clouds crawling over the horizon. The rain came sudden and heavy, hammering the roof and soaking the earth until the yard turned to mud. Calder patched leaks between boards with steady hands, while Asha hauled buckets from the spring, swept water off the porch, and scraped mud away from the barn's foundation with a flatboard. She worked with no complaint, no sign of expecting thanks. Only the quiet determination, of someone who had been told all her life she was useless, and now meant to prove otherwise. He watched her once from the doorway, the wool blanket draped over her shoulders, her hair slicked dark with rain, her moccasins sinking in the muck. Something caught in his chest then, a feeling he hadn't known in years, not desire alone, though that stirred too. It was deeper, like seeing light through smoke after believing the fire had burned out for good. On the second night of the storm, when the wind howled through the cracks like a chorus of cries, Calder lit the fire high and sat sketching by lamplight. His hand moved over the charcoal like it had in years past, tracing not maps or troop lines, but faces long gone. He hadn't drawn since before the fever took his wife, yet now the urge had returned, pulling shapes out of memory. He paused only when a soft knock tapped against his door. No one knocked out here. For a moment he thought he imagined it, but then it came again, quieter. He opened the door to find Asha, hair loose now, eyes wide in the dark. The storm pushed at her back, her blanket clutched around her shoulders. She didn't speak, only glanced at the fire and then at him. He stepped aside, and she crossed the threshold without hesitation. She stood by the hearth for a long while, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were trying to still something inside. Then she turned to him, her voice low but steady. "You said you weren't going to touch me." He nodded. "I'm not." Her gaze held his for a long moment before she said, "Then I can sleep here tonight." There was no plea in it, no barter, only the simple truth of someone too tired to face the dark alone. He gave a nod, and she lay down on the rug by the fire, wrapped in wool, her back turned to him. He sat at the table, watching the flames dance low until her breathing deepened into sleep. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt stillness in his own chest that wasn't hollow. By the third morning, the storm broke into mist, the land quiet beneath pale sky. Calder found her at the hearth already, crouched low, stirring cornmeal into a pot, as if the place had always been hers. She didn't ask permission, she simply acted, and he let her. When he asked if she had cooked before, she nodded once. "For my mother." "For my brother." Her voice didn't crack, but there was an absence in it that made him glance at her longer than he meant to. "You got family left?" he asked. "No." The word was clipped, final. He didn't press. Instead, they ate in silence, and the warmth of it, plain as it was, settled in his gut, stronger than any soldier's ration. After breakfast, he handed her his old slicker to shield her from the wet, sleeves too long, shoulders too wide. She pulled it on without a word and followed him out to the paddock. Together they walked the horses, checked hooves, split kindling. He showed her how to clean a stone from under a gelding's foot. And she learned quick, steady as if each act mattered. When a bird's sudden cry sent her flinching low, arms raised to guard her face, he froze. He had seen that kind of reflex before in camps, in men who came back from battles that never ended in their minds. She swallowed it down, muttered, "Never mind." But he read the truth in her eyes. He didn't press, but he carried it with him, a mark of the battle she carried inside. That night, when the fire cracked and shadows danced against the cabin walls, she drew closer, watching him sketch. This time, she asked who the unfinished face on the page belonged to. My wife, he said after a long silence. She got sick while I was away. I came back too late. Asha's gaze softened, but didn't pity. She only nodded and said, "They buried me too." When they cast me out, her words cut sharp, not for sympathy, but for truth. For the first time, Calder looked at her fully. Not as a stranger in his barn, not as a trespasser on his land, but as someone whose scars matched his own. "You're not cursed," he told her, voice low. "I know that now." Her fingers brushed his hand then, tentative, steady. He didn't pull away. That night she returned to the cot, but her voice drifted across the dark before sleep. "Thank you for not being like the others." He said nothing, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them yet dared to name. The mornings came colder after that storm, frost etching silver across every fence rail, water icing over in the trough before noon. Calder rose before first light as always, but now there was movement inside the cabin that wasn't just his own. The scrape of Asha stirring the fire, the soft rhythm of her feet against the boards, the low rustle of her hair as she leaned close to the flames. Small sounds, but they filled the place with a life it hadn't carried in years. He didn't say it aloud, but he noticed. He noticed the way she rolled the sleeves of his old flannel, how it dwarfed her frame, how she didn't flinch at the torn seam of her deer-hide dress anymore. She carried her scars and her frayed clothes without apology. And somehow, that quiet defiance drew him nearer than any spoken plea could have. Each day they worked side by side, stacking firewood, hauling water, setting kindling in neat rows in the lean-to. Their hands brushed sometimes in the passing of logs, fingers catching just long enough to linger before letting go. Neither mentioned it, but both felt the air shift when it happened. The silence between them, once taut with suspicion, had softened. It held something warmer now, a rhythm that echoed the life of two people choosing, without words, to stay. In the afternoons, Calder took to cleaning the rifles, sitting on the porch with the Henry across his knees, cloth sliding down the barrel slow and steady. Asha came out once and stood watching him, her eyes tracking every motion. "You ever fire one?" he asked, not looking up. She nodded. "My brother taught me." He tested her with his spare Winchester, watched her stance, her grip, the ease with which she handled its weight. She wasn't lying. She didn't lie. He told her then, plain as the weather, "Tomorrow I'll take you out on the rim trail. You need to know the land if you're going to stay." She didn't blink at the word stay. She only nodded, and when her eyes lifted to his, there was a steadiness in them that caught him off guard. "I want to stay," she said, "if that's allowed." He gave her the truth, no hesitation. "It is." The words were simple, but inside him, something shifted like a door opening he hadn't realized was locked. That evening, as the fire burned low, she sat near the hearth with her hair freshly washed, falling dark and long down her back. She wore only his flannel shirt now, her torn dress drying over a chair. The shirt draped her thighs, but left her bare legs stretched toward the warmth. She didn't look ashamed of it, and he didn't look away. He poured her coffee, their fingers brushing deliberate this time when she took the cup. Her touch lingered. He felt it all the way through his chest, a sudden foreign tightness he hadn't known in years. She sipped once, then turned to him with a question that had weight behind it. "You ever think about having a child?" He hesitated, throat thick. "Years ago. My wife wanted children. We never got the chance." The firelight flickered against her face, showing not fear, but a deep openness. "I want to give that to someone," she said softly. "To you. If you'll take it." Her voice carried no barter, no desperation, only choice. Calder turned his head, studied her long, then lifted a hand, calloused and rough, and cupped her cheek. She leaned into it, eyes closing, breath catching not in fear, but in something more tender. When she opened them again, he kissed her, slow, certain, not rushed. She answered, hands resting against his chest, firelight wrapping them both. That night, she didn't return to the cot. She lay in his bed, facing him in the dark, her hand tucked in his, her breathing steady beside his own. He didn't move beyond that, didn't press for more, but something had changed between them. The silence no longer separated, it bound. Calder lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling beams, feeling the presence of her body near his. For the first time in more than a decade, he let himself fall asleep with someone else's breath, carrying him into rest. And for Asha, exiled, bruised, and discarded, it was the first time she had slept without fear of waking to a hand raised against her. When morning came, snow painted the ridges white, thin but certain. Calder rose to stoke the fire, but when he looked back, she was still there, curled under his quilt, hair loose across her shoulder, face calm in the pale dawn light. He paused just for a heartbeat to take in the sight. He hadn't known he could wake to something like this again. She stirred, blinked her eyes open, and whispered a quiet, "Morning." He answered with a nod, nothing more, but inside he felt the weight of the moment settle deep. They ate breakfast together, side by side at the table, snow falling in lazy threads beyond the window. And though no vow had yet been spoken, no ring exchanged, both of them knew neither of them would be leaving. That afternoon, true to his word, he took her out along the rim trail. Snow crunched beneath their boots, rifles slung across their shoulders. He showed her landmarks, the rock outcrops, the creek bed, the cave where he kept supplies. "Oh, you're showing me how to live alone," she said once, her voice carrying a trace of sadness. "No," he told her, steady. "I'm showing you how to stay in case something happens to me." The words tightened her breath, but she didn't argue. Instead, when they returned to the cabin, she caught his hand at the door and spoke plain. "You don't owe me anything, but I want to be yours if you'll take me." She didn't flinch from his gaze when she said it. He stepped forward, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her slow, deeper than before. Not comfort, not mercy, commitment. And when they closed the door behind them, the fire inside was no longer only to hold back winter. It was to mark the beginning of a life neither had dared to hope for again. The snow deepened through the week, settling heavy across the flats until the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Calder and Asha worked slower now, the cold demanding patience from their bodies and their tools. The cabin, once only his shelter, had taken on the shape of something different. 2 cups on the table instead of 1, 2 sets of boots by the hearth, her necklace resting beside his comb on the shelf above the wash basin. These small things, unspoken, marked the truth. She had not only stayed, she had become part of the place. Calder felt it in ways he hadn't expected. The silence of the nights, once sharp and gnawing, had softened into something steady. Her voice in the dark, her quiet laughter at the hearth, the way her hand brushed his without fear. It all worked its way into him like warmth, settling deep into bone. He had not asked her to stay, and she had not begged to. Yet every dawn, when she stirred the fire before he woke, and every dusk, when they sat side by side at the table, the choice was clear. They were staying together. One afternoon, while clearing snow from the roof, Calder climbed down to find Asha waiting at the porch with a cloth bundle in her hands. She unwrapped it slow, offering the crude flatbread she had baked in the hearth. It was rough, uneven, but still warm. "I tried," she said simply. He took a bite, chewed, and nodded once. "Good." Her shoulders lifted, not with pride exactly, but with something lighter. A glimpse of a woman remembering she could give, not only take. That night, he brought out a bottle of apple brandy he had hidden since the year he buried his wife. He hadn't touched it in a decade. Without word, he poured 2 cups. They drank by the fire, the warmth of it mixing with the glow of her presence, loosening something long, locked tight inside him. When she laughed, soft and sudden, he looked at her and felt the years fall away. She confessed she hadn't thought she'd laugh again. He admitted the same. It was a small thing, a sound in the firelight, but for both of them, it carried the weight of survival turned into living. It was then she asked, plain and steady, "If I give you a child, will you give me your name?" The question held no tremor, no bargaining, only resolve. Calder stared at her across the fire, her face lit in amber, her hands steady on the cup. He set his drink aside and told her the truth. "You already have it. You're Ashavain. You live here with me. That won't change." Her eyes softened, and she reached out, touching his neck with a reverence that broke him open. "Then I want to start trying," she whispered. He kissed her again, deeper, certain. That night, the quilt fell to the floor, and the two of them lay together without fear or hesitation. She traced his scars as if reading a story. He held her, as if anchoring himself back to the world. There was no urgency, no shame, only belonging. And when it was done, when the fire burned low and she lay tangled against him, her hand drew slow lines over the scar on his ribs. "You never asked me to explain everything," she said softly. He kissed her hair and answered, "I didn't need to." That truth settled between them heavier than vows, stronger than any prayer. The days stretched into rhythm after that, winter pressing down, but their bond holding firm. Asha didn't return to the cot again. Her things lived in the cabin now. She used his comb, patched her dress by firelight, moved through the rooms as if she had always been meant to. Calder felt the change in ways quiet and unexpected. He caught her brushing her hair before the hearth, her bare feet soft against the floorboards, her shoulders no longer curled in shame, but upright and strong. He noticed the way her hands sometimes lingered low on her stomach, a private gesture she didn't speak of, but one that made his chest tighten with a hope he hadn't let himself feel since his wife was alive. He saw it again one morning as frost glimmered outside, the subtle rise in her belly, the thoughtful way her palm rested there. He didn't press her for words. He only brought her coffee and felt the weight of her leaning briefly against his side as she took it. By early spring, when the sage pushed green again through the thawing dirt, he saw the truth plain. She was carrying life, his, watching her kneel by the porch, planting beans, hair tied back with leather cord, her hand lingering often at her waist. He knew without asking. He crouched beside her, gruff but careful. "You shouldn't be bending like that," she smirked faintly. "I'm pregnant." Not. Broken, his jaw tightened. Part frustration, part awe. She brushed her hair from her face and leaned against his shoulder, teasing. "You're the one who let a woman sleep in your barn after she tried to steal your food." He chuckled, and for the first time in years, The sound carried easy. From his pocket, he pulled a silver ring, plain and worn. He didn't make speeches, didn't kneel. He simply held it out. "You want this?" Her eyes widened, steady as always. "Yes," she said, "I do." He slid it onto her finger, dirt still on her hands, and she kissed him in the sunlight. That night, as she stitched tiny clothes by firelight, Calder worked outside, clearing land behind the barn. Not for corn, not for cattle, but for the future they had chosen. When he came back in, she looked up with eyes calm and strong. And for the first time in years, Calder Vane felt whole. The days that followed were marked by quiet strength, the kind that grows only when two people decide, without vow, without audience, that they will stand beside one another. Calder felt it first, in the way Asha moved through the cabin now, not as a guest or cast-off, but as a woman who had claimed her place. Her necklace lay beside his comb on the shelf, her stitching draped across the chair, her laughter still rare, warming the rafters more than any fire could. He had not asked her to belong. She had simply chosen it. And in her choosing, he felt his own life shift from survival into something steadier. Yet beyond the walls of that cabin, the world still held its cruelties. Calder knew men, and he knew what stories could stir in their mouths when they spoke of women cast out and marked by rumor. That knowledge sat heavy on him, even as the land softened into spring, even as Asha's hand began to rest more often against the small swell of her belly. It was on a morning clear and sharp with frost that the first test came. Calder was out on the porch, rifle resting against his knee, when he spotted the rider along the ridge trail. One man, moving slow but steady, a coat dragging behind his saddle. Calder stiffened, eyes narrowing, jaw set. Asha stepped out beside him, pulling his flannel tighter across her shoulders. "You expecting anyone?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "No." He told her to stay near, but she shook her head. She stood firm at his side as the rider stopped short of the gate and raised a hand. His name was Ryland, a trapper from the north, or so he said. But Calder read the intent in his eyes, the way they lingered past him to catch sight of Asha. "Heard tell of a woman seen wandering near Red Bluff," Ryland said. "Apache, pretty thing, alone. Thought maybe she came this way." Calder didn't lower his rifle. "Don't know anything about Red Bluff." But Ryland's gaze shifted, catching the figure of Asha at Calder's shoulder. "She yours?" His voice carried the kind of weight Calder despised, the kind that treated women like property, like spoils. Calder's voice cut low and steady. "She's not anyone's but her own." The silence stretched long. Ryland's smirk faltered, but his eyes lingered too long on Asha. "Funny thing," he said. "Word is she brought a curse down on her people. Thought someone might want her back." Calder's grip on the rifle tightened. "She's not going back." The words dropped like iron between them. Ryland studied him a moment longer, then mounted again, reins snapping sharp. "Didn't come for trouble, he said. But Calder watched every movement until the rider disappeared behind the rocks, the dust settling in the pale morning light. Only then did he let out the breath he'd held tight in his chest. Beside him, Asha exhaled too, her shoulders easing but her eyes clear with resolve. "And they're still watching," she whispered. Calder shook his head. "Doesn't matter." Her gaze held his. "It does to them. To me, it doesn't." That night, as firelight danced across the cabin walls, Asha spoke truths she had kept hidden. The story of her exile had always carried weight, but now she laid the full burden before him. It hadn't been a man of her tribe who forced himself on her, she said, but a white trader who came under guise of barter. He had taken more than he gave, and when the child was lost, her people had blamed her body, her voice, her defiance. They told me to stay quiet, she said, her voice low but unwavering. Said it would stir more trouble if I spoke. But I didn't stay quiet. I screamed. I fought. And when the baby didn't live, they said I was cursed. Calder sat silent for a long moment, the crack of the fire filling the room. Then he set his rifle aside, stepped closer, and laid a calloused hand against her cheek. You're not cursed, he said, steady and firm. You're the strongest damn person I've ever met. Her eyes glistened, one tear slipping free, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, letting herself be seen not as shame, not as exile, but as herself. Later, she sat beside him on the bed, his coat draped around her shoulders. He opened his sketchbook, not to draw ghosts of the past, but her profile by firelight, her hair loose, her lips parted faintly as she watched the flames. When she caught him in the act, she smiled soft. You going to hang that on the wall? She asked. If you let me. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice hushed. You're not afraid they'll come back? He answered with the truth only men who've lived through war can give. I've had worse come for me. She studied him then, not with fear, but with a kind of awe. You think we'll make it? He turned to her, remembering the girl who had once tried to steal oats in the night, bruised and starved, offering her worth as a bargain. We already are, he said, and she believed him. That night they lay down, together again, her body warm against his, their hands linked beneath the blanket. No more questions, no more doubt, just the steady truth of two exiles who had chosen one another. Outside, snow fell soft across the rim country, covering the scars of earth in quiet white. Inside, the fire burned low, and for the first time in either of their lives, the silence did not mean emptiness. It meant peace. Neither of them dreamed of running. They had found their place. They had found each other. The snow lingered long across the flats. The world hushed beneath its weight. But inside the cabin, silence had taken on a new shape. No longer hollow, no longer sharp. It had become the space where Calder and Asha spoke without words, where glances carried meaning and small touches rooted deeper than speech. By early winter's end, they moved with the rhythm of a pair long accustomed to each other. Calder would split wood in the yard, his hands sure, his breath rising white, while Asha stacked the pieces neat in the lean-to, sleeves rolled and cheeks flushed with effort. When they brushed hands in passing, neither pulled away. At the table, 2 tin cups always waited, and in the evenings by the hearth, she stitched while he sketched, both absorbed, both content in the shared quiet. Yet trust is not built only by comfort. It is proven in moments when the shadows of the past come clawing back, when a man's wounds and a woman's scars threaten to choke the life they're trying to make. For Calder and Asha, those moments came not in fire or thunder, but in the gentler trials of daily work, the chance to prove they were not alone anymore. It was one such morning when Calder found her crouched near the goat pen, tangled wire biting into her hands. You fixin' to take my job? He asked, tone flat but edged with humor. She glanced up, eyes bright against the sun, and quipped, You move too slow. He grunted, half laugh, surprised how easy it felt in his chest. Her first jest had been a spark. Now it burned into something warmer. They finished the fence together, shoulders nearly brushing. tools passing hand to hand, as if they'd always known the measure of each other's work. Calder noticed the way she steadied a stake without being asked, the way her grip held firm despite knuckles rubbed raw. He felt something stir in him then, not pity, not obligation, but respect. And beneath that respect, a quiet admiration he hadn't dared let rise in years. As the days lengthened, she learned the land under his guidance. He showed her the rim trails, the springs that stayed open through winter, the old caves where he kept supplies. She learned quick, memorizing each landmark with eyes that missed nothing. "You're showing me how to live here alone," she said once, voice carrying a shadow. He shook his head. "I'm showing you how to stay, if something happens to me." Her breath caught. Her steps faltered, but she said no more. The truth of it weighed heavy on both of them, that their bond was not just warmth against the cold, but a tether against a world that could strip them of everything without warning. It was in their evenings, though, that the shape of trust took root deepest. Asha began to leave her stitching aside and move closer to the fire, sitting where the glow painted her features soft. Calder sketched in silence, the lines of her face taking form on the page without him meaning to. When she caught him, she did not shrink or accuse. She smiled faint, tilting her head. "Who is she?" she asked of one half-finished portrait. "My wife," he said after a pause. "She wanted children." We never got the chance. Asha's gaze dropped to the fire, her voice low but steady. "I want to give that to someone, to you. If you'll take it." He felt the words strike deep, not as plea but as offering. He reached out, cupping her cheek, and when she leaned into his hand, he kissed her slow and certain. The fire cracked. The storm outside rattled the shutters, but within the cabin, something stronger than weather had taken hold. From then on, their bond grew in ways both subtle and plain. Asha no longer lingered on the cot. Her place was at his side, beneath his quilt, her hand finding his in the dark. Calder, who had slept for years with one ear open and a rifle near, now found his chest rise and fall in unison with hers. His nights deeper, calmer. In the mornings, he rose not to silence, but to the scent of coffee and the sound of her stirring the hearth. Each day they worked together, her swinging an axe with clean precision, him teaching her the care of rifle and horse. When a bird call startled her once, sending her body low in an old reflex, Calder saw the ghost of her past flash in her eyes. He didn't press her with questions. He only nodded, letting her know he had seen and would not judge. In that moment, she realized she could carry her scars without hiding them. He would not turn away. There was tenderness, too, found in small things. Her hair spread across his chest as she drifted to sleep, his hand resting protective at the curve of her stomach, their laughter over the first loaf of bread she baked that came out rough but sweet. Each act became a thread, weaving them into something neither dared name, but both felt growing with undeniable strength. Calder began to picture a life no longer marked only by loss. Asha began to believe she was not cursed, not cast out, but chosen. And so the silence of the cabin became not a wound, but a balm. In the steady rhythm of shared chores, in the glow of firelight on her face, in the strength of his hand holding hers, trust took root, like seed in thawing ground. Both knew storms would come again, of men, of weather, of memory. But for now, here in the stillness, they had found shelter in each other. And that shelter, hard-earned and fiercely kept, was stronger than anything the world beyond their fence could muster. The fire burned steady in those nights, and so too did the quiet between them. It wasn't the brittle hush of strangers anymore. It was the hush of belonging, of two souls who had found a rhythm in each other's company. And Calder felt it in the way her hand slipped into his without thought, in the way her laughter, soft, still cautious, came easier now by the hearth. Asha felt it in his gaze, steady and unyielding, not stripping her down to weakness, but lifting her into worth. They had been forged by exile, both of them, but together they had built something that defied the world's verdict. And it was in that warmth, in that growing certainty, that she finally spoke the words that would change everything. One night, with the fire painting her hair in threads of copper, she asked if he ever thought of children. His silence was heavy before he answered, admitting the truth of what he and his late wife never had. She listened, then told him plain, "I want to make something new with you. Not out of fear, because I choose it." The words landed deeper than any vow. Calder had seen men die for less than a choice spoken in the quiet of a cabin. He turned to her, his hand rough against her cheek, and kissed her slow, certain. That night their bodies joined, not in desperation, but in belonging. Asha touched his scars like they were maps of the life he had endured. He held her as if she were the anchor tying him to the present. When the fire dimmed to coals and her head rested against his chest, Calder lay awake with one truth resounding in his mind. He had not been left behind. He had been given another chance, one born not of pity, but of choice freely made. From that night on, she no longer belonged to the cot in the corner. Her place was beside him. Her dress, once draped across a chair to dry, now hung with his shirts. Her moccasins rested beside his boots at the hearth. Two lives that had been stripped bare now clothed each other in the simplest of ways. In the morning, she moved through the cabin as though she had always been meant to stir its fire, to brew its coffee, to bend its seams. Calder watched her with quiet, feeling the weight of years loosen in his chest. He had built this cabin with his own hands, but until now it had never been a home. She had made it one without asking. They worked the land together through the last of winter, their shoulders brushing as they split kindling, their laughter rising when she teased him for moving too slow with the axe. He taught her how to oil a rifle properly, how to read the sky for storms, how to mark the trails by rock and tree. She learned fast, and with each lesson, he realized he was no longer preparing her to leave. He was preparing her to stay. The words she had spoken, "I want to make something new," echoed in him as he watched her tie her hair back with leather cord. As he caught her brushing her palm across her belly with a quiet, thoughtful look. He did not press her to speak it aloud, but he knew. Life was stirring within her. His. The world beyond their cabin, though, did not forget them. Whispers still drifted on the wind, of curses, of exile, of a woman blamed for what had never been her fault. Calder knew men well enough to know someone might come calling again. When the trapper Ryland had lingered too long with his questions, Calder had seen in his eyes the hunger for a story to twist. But Asha was no longer the trembling figure who had once offered herself to survive. She stood beside Calder now, steady as stone, her voice calm but resolved when she told him the truth of her past. It had been a white trader, not a man of her people, who had taken more than he gave, who had left her to carry the blame. She had not stayed quiet. She had fought, screamed, scarred him, and when the child was lost, her people had turned their shame into her burden. She spoke it all in the firelight, not for pity, but for truth. Calder listened, then set his hand to her face and told her plain, You're not cursed. You're the strongest damn person I've ever met. That night he sketched her profile by firelight, not as a ghost or a wound, but as his present.
Hmm.
She caught him, smiled faint, and leaned her head against his shoulder. You think we'll make it? She asked. He looked at her long, remembering the starving girl in the barn, the tremble in her voice when she first begged for mercy. He shook his head. We already are. And she believed him. When spring broke at last, the land softened, sage turning green and earth loosening from frost. Calder leaned on the fence, watching Asha kneel in the dirt, her hand lingering often at the rise of her stomach. She planted beans slow, patient, her hair braided neat, her body moving different now, protective, softer. He crouched beside her, gruff but tender. You shouldn't be bending like that. She smirked, brushing hair from her cheek. I'm pregnant, not broken. He couldn't help the faint smile tugging his mouth. She leaned into him, teasing. You're the one who let a woman sleep in your barn after she tried to steal your food. They both chuckled, knowing how far they had come, from hay and bruises to soil and seed, from exile to home. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky and fire, Calder pulled something from his pocket, a silver ring, simple and worn. He didn't make speeches, he only held it out. Her eyes widened, steady as ever. You want this? He asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. He slid it onto her finger and she kissed him with sunlight still warm on their faces. That night, beneath the glow of the hearth, she stitched tiny clothes while he sharpened tools. He cleared ground behind the barn, not for corn or cattle, but for the life they were building. And when the first stars opened above the ridge, Calder felt the weight of the years lift. For the first time in a long time, he was not alone in his silence. For the first time, it was enough. The weeks turned soft with spring, but not without shadow. Snowmelt carved shallow streams through the flats, and the scent of sage drifted green where once only dust held. Calder leaned often against the porch rail, rifle near at hand, watching the land with eyes that had learned too well not to trust a horizon that seemed quiet. Asha worked nearby, planting beans and tending goats, her hand drifting often to the swell at her waist. The life they both knew now was growing steady within her. Their home had found rhythm. Two hands working in tandem, two voices sharing the silence. Yet it was in that steadiness that the first true test came. A rider along the ridge, lean horse and sharper eyes, carrying the kind of words meant to unsettle. Ryland, a trapper by trade, a man Calder remembered from the lean years, now comes sniffing after stories. He stopped short of the gate, his voice easy, but his gaze lingering too long on Asha. He spoke of Red Bluff, of whispers about a woman who had brought a curse upon her people, of someone who might be wanted back. Calder stood between them, rifle easy in his hand, but weight enough in his voice. She's not going back. Those words rang like steel across the cold morning air, and Ryland knew well enough to measure the man before him. Still, his eyes hung too long on Asha, and only when the silence stretched tight did he finally mount and ride on, the dust trailing behind like a warning. Calder did not relax until the ridge swallowed him whole. Asha stood firm beside him, her voice calm but edged when she whispered, "They're still watching." He turned, his gaze steady. "Doesn't matter." She shook her head, quiet but resolved. "It does to them. To me, it doesn't." That night, in the glow of the fire, she spoke what she had not yet told in full. The truth of her exile spilled plain, her voice low, steady as the flames. It hadn't been her people who had broken her, but a white trader who came under guise of barter, sugar, flour, and lies. He had taken more than his trade, and when the child was lost, her people turned blame upon her shoulders. They told me to stay quiet, she said, eyes not wavering. Said it would stir more trouble if I spoke. But I didn't. I fought, I screamed, I marked his face, and still they cast me out. Calder listened, jaw tight, the weight of his own war years heavy in his chest. Then he reached out, calloused hand warm against her cheek, and said what no one else had ever told her. You're not cursed. You're the strongest damn person I've ever met. A single tear slid down her face, not of weakness but of release. She leaned into his hand, and for the first time since her exile, she believed the words. Afterward, when she rested against him, his coat around her shoulders, Calder opened his sketchbook. But instead of ghosts of war or faces of the dead, his hand drew her. Asha by firelight, hair loose, lips parted, faint as if she were caught between breath and word. She caught him, smiled faint. You going to hang that on the wall? She asked. If you let me. She rested her head against his shoulder, her voice soft, almost a whisper. You're not afraid they'll come back? Calder's answer was plain, steady as stone. I've had worse come for me. She tilted her face toward him then, eyes searching. You think we'll make it? He turned, his gaze steady on hers. We already are. From that moment, the air in the cabin changed again. No longer just survival. No longer just shelter. It was defiance. It was claiming a life the world had said neither deserved. At night, beneath the quilt, they held hands beneath the blankets, their breaths mingling in the dark. In the mornings, they woke to one another's presence not as surprise, but as truth. Asha rose to tend the fire, her hand resting once more on her belly, while Calder readied the tools for the day. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew. This was family already. The land stretched green as spring deepened, but Calder's vigilance sharpened with it. He scanned the ridges more often, checked the latch on the barn twice before blowing out the lamp. Asha saw it, and instead of shrinking, she steadied him. You can't guard me from every shadow, she said once, her hand warm against his arm. I can guard you from enough, he answered. She believed him, but more than that, she knew she was no longer a burden in need of saving. She had chosen to stay, and that meant she would fight too. It was one evening, quiet save for the goats stirring in the pen, when she looked at him across the table and said plain, Don't send me back out there. I don't care what people said about me. This feels real. Calder set down his cup, leaned forward and met her eyes. You're not going anywhere. Not now, not ever. The silence after carried more weight than any vow. That night when they lay side by side, her hand resting in his, Calder felt the truth settle deep in his bones. Whatever came, they would face it as one. Outside, the sage rustled in the warming wind, the land waking to another season. Inside, by the glow of fire and the strength of two hands clasped together, something greater than survival had taken root. It was belonging, chosen and defended. It was family, forged from exile and pain, but stronger than either could have dreamed alone. And for Calder Vane and Asha, that was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The last of the snow melted slow, trickling through gullies and ridges until the flats showed their bones again. Sage turned green in patches. The sky widened into a softer blue, and the land began to breathe after winter's long grip. Calder leaned against the porch post, arms folded, watching as Asha knelt in the soil with her hair tied back, leather cord glinting in the morning light, her hands pressed carefully into the earth, planting beans in even rows, her movements steady, patient. Every so often, her palm drifted low across her belly, not as if to hide, but as if to shield. He had noticed it more in recent weeks, and though she hadn't said the words aloud, he knew. Her body had changed, slower, softer, and the pantry always seemed lighter by more than his appetite could account for. He had seen life take root before in cattle in the earth, but never like this. This was different. This was his. He walked down the steps, boots crunching softly in the thawed dirt, and crouched beside her. "You shouldn't be bending like that," he said, gruff but careful. She smirked, brushing hair from her cheek. Pregnant, not broken." He grunted, half a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She leaned into him then, teasing, "You're the one who let a woman sleep in your barn after she tried to steal your food." He chuckled low, remembering the girl wrapped in rags and bruises, trembling in the shadow of his rifle. How far they had come. Now she was here in sunlight, wearing his shirt, planting their food, carrying his child, from desperation to belonging, from exile to home. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the silver ring he had carried for weeks, worn plain, nothing fancy, but it was the only piece of promise he had left in him. He held it out, no speech, no ceremony. "You want this?" he asked. Her eyes widened, steady but shining. "Yes," she said without hesitation, and he slid it onto her finger, dirt still clinging to her hands, and she kissed him right there, with sunlight warming both their faces. In that moment, no priest, no paper, no neighbor's judgment mattered. The land bore witness, and that was enough. The days that followed settled into quiet work and quiet joy. Calder built a rocking chair for the porch, smoothing the wood until it shone in the light. Asha stitched small clothes by the fire, her hands steady as she shaped cloth into a future. Curtains made from old flannel hung now at the cabin's window, softening the morning glare, making the place feel less like a fortress and more like a home. At night they sat by the hearth together, her comb brushing slow through her hair, his sketchbook open across his knee. He no longer drew the dead. He drew her. Sometimes she laughed at the likeness. Sometimes she only leaned close and let her hand rest over his. Either way, the pages filled with her face, with the life she had breathed back into his world. One late afternoon, Asha returned from the spring with a basket of wild greens. She paused on the porch, hand pressed against her back. Calder noticed, set his hammer aside, and walked to her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. She nodded, breath steady. "He kicked," she whispered, eyes wide, voice caught between awe and disbelief. She took his hand and pressed it low across her belly. For a long moment, there was nothing, only the warmth of her skin beneath his calloused palm, and then, faint but certain, a nudge, small yet undeniable. Calder's throat tightened, his jaw working to hold steady, but his eyes betrayed him. "Guess he's real then," he muttered, voice thick. Asha's smile trembled. "So are we." That night by the fire, she leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, her hand over his. "You ever think this would happen?" she asked. Calder stared into the flames, remembering the war, the fever that took his wife, the long years of silence that followed. "No," he admitted. "I thought I deserved to be alone." She lifted her head, meeting his gaze steady. "Then you let me stay?" He shook his head faintly. "You stayed because you chose to." Her hand tightened over his. "And I'll keep choosing to." As the weeks passed, the land grew bright with spring, and their work turned toward the future. Calder cleared a patch behind the barn, saying it was for corn, but both of them knew it was more. It was for what came next. For the family they had made out of mercy and choice. Asha planted beans, stitched more small clothes, and hummed sometimes while she worked. A sound Calder had never heard from her before, but one that filled the cabin with warmth. He found himself checking the door twice, at night, not out of fear anymore, but out of instinct to protect what he could not bear to lose. And when his hand rested over hers in the dark, over the child growing within her, he felt a peace that no rifle, no land deed, no soldier's victory had ever given him. They had come from silence, from scars, from exile and war and hunger. Now they had found something stronger. They had found peace. Asha, once discarded, carried life and wore his ring. Calder, once hollow, now sketched her face and built chairs for the life they would share. They did not need vows or witnesses. Their bond had been forged in the hardest fire of all, the fire of survival. And when they stepped out onto the porch together, side by side, watching the sun fall across the rim, they knew the truth, plain. They had built something the world could not take away. That night, under a sky crowded with stars, Calder lay with Asha beside him, her head on his chest, his hand curved protectively over her belly. Outside, the wind moved gentle through the sage, no longer carrying threat but promise. Inside, the fire glowed steady. Neither of them dreamed of running anymore. They had found home, found family, found each other. And for the first time since either could remember, that was enough, more than enough.